Thank you, Stephen. And I'm going to start off by trying to find out a little bit about the audience and whether or not my technology works. So we're going to launch a poll for everybody here. And you should all be seeing that on your screen. So what I would like you to do is to click on the answer that applies to you. Do you work in an organization that's used as a supplier, a customer, a research or an insight community or an MROC or a community panel in the last 12 months? And we'll give that just a little bit longer. 40% of everyone has voted. And yeah, we're coming up to 60%, so it looks like we're going to be about 40% non-voting. We'll give it just a moment longer. And I think if I click this button, it should move on and show you the results. Well, it's not showing me. Oh, share. So you can all see the results now. And what's quite interesting there is that the bit of the screen I need to read obscured is 65% of you work in an organization that has already used communities. 16% plan to use them in the near future, and no plans 20%. And an amazing 0% don't know, not applicable, which is quite rewarding. So we should be able to hide that now and get back to the presentation. Because I want to put this in the context of a publication that came out earlier in the week, the GRIT study, which I think is on its 12th or 13th edition now, produced by Green Book. And it looks at a wide variety of things in the research industry. But it mostly talks to the avant-garde, if you think that they're really good people, or it talks to the chattering classes if you're not so sure. It's the people who tend to read the modern press, the people who tend to be connected in LinkedIn, the people who tend to read blogs, the people who tend to attend events like this today. Now let's turn that around so that we can read it slightly more easily. And what the GRIT study has found recently is that overwhelmingly the leading new research technique are online communities. Amongst the sampling GRIT, it was 45%. Not as good as the people in this study here at 65%, 83% either using it now or plan to use it shortly. What else is big news? Mobile surveys, and you can see the impact of that from Leslie's presentation. Social media analytics, and again you can see some impact of that from Julie's. And text analytics, when we start listening to how much text is being collected. If you run conversations with people in a community, even with 50 or 100 people for a year, you get an enormous amount of text. So text analytics becoming very important. And a little bit further down the screen, if we add together how many are doing it and how many plan to doing it, mobile qualitative. So we can see a lot of themes coming together in the world of market research at the moment. Now I'm going to pull together some numbers that I'm presenting in a few weeks' time at the SMR APAC, which actually started off as looking at communities in the context of Asia, but became a rather broader presentation. It's about 17 pages, so there's not time for that today. So I'm going to give you just 4 or 5 top-line numbers that I think are really worth keeping in mind. In 2012, it looks as though about 3% of global research spend was spent via communities. There are 2 or 3 different strands pulling that information together, but it looks like it accounts for about 3%. That is massively bigger than most other new forms of market research. But where is it going? Well, the predictions that were coming out, particularly last year, there was a blogger in Research World, there was Mike Hall writing in Research Live, Scott Miller of Vision Critical, all looking towards it being 15 to 25% of spend within just a few more years, because people are seeing it as so fundamental that brands start to connect with their customers and have ongoing conversations. As part of the study for APAC, NewMR did a study of the people who follow and take part in NewMR. And amongst those people, 50% of the people who are interested in this part of the business, who have used, who sell, who have bought, who have benefited from research communities. So very slightly less than the percentage who turn up to a course like this, which is at 65%, not surprisingly, but similar sorts of numbers. Now, one of the projects I was involved in last year was the SMR prices study. And in that study, we ask a much broader sample of research companies, and we only go to every research company once. We do it on a global basis. We do it with our, and we can start to get a bit more of an insight about how big our communities, not amongst people who are interested in new market research. They're about a half. But if we go beyond that, we start to get a number that we can put a bit of scale to. And it looks like that if you go to a country or Lithuania, and you find out the number of companies who can offer large-scale online projects, people who do 100 interviews a week, people who can do a 5,000 survey of such and such. So if you work out how many companies can do a large online project, then about 20% of that number are offering research communities. It's not always the same companies, because in some of those countries, Thailand is a great example. There are a couple of really good research companies there who are offering qualitative research communities, but they're not offering large online companies. So although the scale is right, it's not always sense. So that gives us a method of looking at countries and starting to get a sense of the scale of the market. We also used, I'm very glad that Julie showed that predictive analysis, because amongst the people involved in NewMR, we asked them to do a predictive analysis to estimate what the market was like where they lived. And we get a fairly consistent estimate of 10 to 25% of major brands in their market have used or are using research communities, insight communities. Now, one of the things that is very different between, say, China and North America is there are many more major brands in North America than there are in China, even though the Chinese economy is fast catching up, may soon overtake. In terms of established major brands, the USA has got much more heritage, much more presence. There are far more communities at the moment in the USA than there are in China. But by this definition of what is a major brand, we're seeing 10 to 25%. Now, I was in two minds on this slide about whether to talk about tens of thousands or thousands, and I went for the more conservative thousands. There are clearly thousands of communities in use around the world. There are, I think, probably tens of thousands of insight communities around the world. This has become a very, very mainstream feature, and that's certainly one of the findings from the GRIT report, where it talks about it becoming a mainstream. So we need to recognize that the world has changed, and to do that, I want to look backwards and say, well, how do we get to where we are today? And there is a continuum in terms of communities. There are communities of fewer than 30. Kiosk, for example, quite often does really very small communities, 8, 12 people. There are communities of considerably more than 50,000 people. That is one of the big differences. Of course, those community things, I can almost hear Diane Heston talking in the background to me, they are very different sorts of communities. You don't get an intense community of 50,000 people. It is a different entity to one of 100 people who are working together. And we also have duration. We have short-term communities. Sometimes, I think the shortest I ever worked on was 3 days. And there are now many, many communities which are years and years old. So we have this big, big dimension going on, but really that breaks into a sort of a discrete split of short-term versus continuous. And if we look at the left-hand side of this chart, what we have are what Forrester and Brad Bortner of Forrester a few years ago termed MROCs, essentially qualitative research communities. They tended to use, when they were first created, repurposed software. So they might have started with bulletin boards, they might have started with Ning, or they would use something like Drupal and they would write it and create their own platform. Weren't any tools. How it worked, the respondents, the participants, it had to be right for them very, very quickly, almost from the beginning. They had to look for clients. They ran the community. It was the world was very different. They were market. Then we say from large groups of 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 people, much more quant than qual. They would often say we do quant and qual. Yes, but it was like 95% quant. Very strong panel management, relatively weak qualitative tools, or get branching out into separate areas. And then we had the black hole sector, where there were almost no short-term large communities. The difficulty of setting them up, of recruiting them, really made them not worthwhile if you had only had 2 weeks, 3 weeks to do the research. So we ended up with a nomenclature, and we still use it today really, of thinking about insight communities based on the platform that's underneath them. If they came from one type of platform, they tend to be thought of as MROC. If they came from another type of platform, they tended to be thought of as community panels. And I think that picture is changing and changing rapidly, because what's happened, and it's great that one of the sponsors here today is from one of those platforms that have led to change. The platforms have been evolving. We've got far more tools for the researcher now. One of the tools we've not talked about today is the Revelation ethnography tool. Really, really lots of facilities for the researcher. And I think that is one of the things that we've seen from the Dub tool, we see from the 2020 tool, more and more tools for the researcher to be able to do their job better. We're seeing much more qual in the big platforms. We've probably seen actually a bit of a schism. Some of the big platforms have more qual, and some of them have more or less left the market research industry and gone into sort of enterprise feedback systems, where perhaps the world is a little simpler. We're seeing a lot more integration between platforms. So within the last few months, colleagues of mine or myself have used the Vision Critical platform with Kiosk. We've used it with Revelation. We've used it with ESOS. We've used it with Visions Life. We've used it with Dub, including in London. We've used it with 2020. Typically taking subsets of communities out and saying, we'd like you 8 people to use this Kiosks platform and to do this. We'd like you 50 mums to come out of this platform and use the Dub software and do this. So all of a sudden we're moving into a world where it's much more mix and match, where we're recognizing that we don't always have a single solution. Much more integration with other systems. So people are beginning to talk to the likes of Gemius and NetPanel and about putting tracking tools onto the PCs of community members, with a certain reservations that Leslie mentioned in terms of flattening their battery, of putting them onto their smartphones with informed consent as part of a conversation, talking to the banks, the media companies, the travel companies about linking to big data, because everything else that our clients are doing is linking together, and we need to make sure that we can get into that world and start adding something to that picture. So we now start talking about platform agnostic communities, and this is the second time that agnostic has appeared in the presentations. Leslie also used the term in terms of how mobile needs to move forward. So we can start thinking about relationship qualitative research, where the incentive tends to be the relationship. So it might be long-term, because that's where the relationship kicks in. We're using a small number of people, and we're going to keep that sort of platform going. Relationship qual and quant, where we have the relationship with people over a large amount of time. In the previous session, we had a presentation from Lisa Clark of Discovery Channel. You see over 3,000 people. They have response plus surveys and for their qualitative exercises. Their incentive is a cash draw each month, $150 plus. Most members will never get to win a prize during their lifetime in the community. It's really just a method of saying, thank you, we respect you, but the whole is around the relationship. Somebody needs to they need to talk about a website. They've got some ideas they need to discuss. It's going to be a small community, it's going to be short term, it's going to be motivated mostly by money. You still want to make it fun, you still want to make it exciting, but actually, if you really want people to work hard and you don't have a relationship with those people, you are going to have to pay them to do that. And we're going to start seeing more. And when you look at the recordings, which are going to be available sometime next week, there's a fantastic presentation from Cathay Pacific in Hong Kong, where they did a community of 600 people for about 3 weeks, mostly quant, but a little bit of qual, lots and lots of information through. But a lot of the time when we do that sort of tactical research, because we don't have an ongoing relationship with them, it's going to be cash driven. So rather than thinking in terms of MROCs and community panels, I think as we go forward, we're going to start thinking much more about what the research is and whether it's a relationship, whether it's strategic, or whether it's tactical. Generically, I think we're going to call them insight communities or research communities or some sort of term. I think we do need to get away from these sort of community panel and MROC. I think that they are slightly holding back the understanding, particularly when you talk to the C-suite. When you talk to a CMO, they don't want to know what an MROC is. They want to know about the sorts of conversations they can have with their customers and their people they need to connect with. So there are some big trends going on in market research at the moment. The first one, brought to life wonderfully by Leslie, is the whole mobile thing. There are far more mobiles than PCs. We have our mobiles with us all the time. There are plenty of parts of the world where there are a tiny number of mobiles. I'm going to be in India later in the month. There are only something like 65 million people connected to the internet via PCs. There are 850 million mobile phones. If we want to move forward, we have to be mobile enabled. We have this whole big data thing. It's something which we need to interface to. We need to start looking at behavioral data and ethnographic data, purchase and transactional data, getting right inside people's lives, understanding how they travel, how they move around, and how they interact. And at every part of that journey, there will be a missing piece that research can provide, and which I think all of us who have spoken today would say that communities are particularly well placed to do. So the heart of customer obsession is really where I see the communities. Transactional, we'll collect that sort of data, or in fact, we won't. Brands will collect it, retailers will collect it, they will assemble it as their big data. We're going to get more behavioral data. Some of that will come from market research. A lot of it will come from CCTV, from RFIDs tracking people's behavior, from loyalty card data and so on. We're going to be listening to what people say in social media, taking it with a pinch of salt. But then if we want to understand their hearts and minds, when we want to understand what they feel and think and why they did things, that is going to be research, and that's the place where communities, I think, are going to focus. I see very much an integrated future. At the outer level, brands are going to connect with every one of their customers at some level, be that the NPS, be that the customer satisfaction, be that the complaints mechanism. They're going to link that through to social media. They're going to link that through to whatever big data they can purchase. And then within that, I see an intensive community much bigger than the existing communities, 100K to 500K, because within there, people will run surveys, they will run focus groups, they will run co-creation ethnography, they will run what we currently call MROCs. You may have 100 mavens, you may have 100 home cook mums, you may have 100 stop-at-home dads. Within that, doing an exercise, short-term or long-term, that's essentially qualitative and providing feedback. And it's going to be a method of pulling all of these pieces together that I think is the next step that we're going to see. I do see 4 challenges, however, for insight communities. first one calling Poisoning the Well. I was in Tokyo in when was I in Tokyo? I think it was November, but it might have been January. And we met a lot of interesting people, but I met more clients who had had unsatisfactory communities in Tokyo than I'd met anywhere else in the world. The analysis that they had been given was poor, poor surveys, abusing members, but in particular, it was where discussions had been run and qualitative communities had been set up, and the client had simply been given, here is what people said. And as we all know, the interesting thing is, what did people mean? What was the analysis of what they said? And that was what was lacking in a number of them. I also saw some great market research on online communities in Japan. Don't get the wrong impression. But it suddenly brought my eyes open my eyes to, if a new client has a really bad experience with a short-term or a long-term community, be it a qualitative community or a quantitative community, it's going to put them off. So we have a great responsibility to share the learning, to make sure that clients' first experience with this new technique is a positive one. We've got to understand how to fit into the client's wider business. The best place for a community, the sorts of community that Julie was talking about, the sorts of communities that we work with, is very central. We don't just want to be talking to insight managers. The people in the organization need to know that there is no excuse for just guessing. The vast majority of business decisions are done on gut as opposed to intellect. There is really no excuse for that. They should be talking to their customers. They should know that this is central to how they're going forward. It's got to integrate with other data sources. It's got to link to big data in particular. And it's got to be an open platform. I was a couple of sessions recently where I was talking to clients who said, yeah, we want to use your software, but we want to use a different agency. And other clients who said, well, we want to use you as an agency and software, but actually some of the time we don't. For this exercise, we want to bring in that piece of software. For this exercise, we want to bring in that researcher. And I think that is the next challenge, that for all of us, we need to think about being much more like an app store, an Android or whatever, facilitating a range of solutions. There is no way that any one provider over the next 5 years is going to have the investment to be the best in class at all the tools going forward.